The sound shattered the morning silence like a grenade going off in my chest. Susie's scream tore through the house, yanking me out of bed before I even realized I was moving. My feet hit the hardwood floor hard, cold beneath me, but I barely felt it as I ran toward the front yard. My daughter only screamed like that when something was truly wrong, and with Susie, there was always that small voice in the back of my head that feared the worst. I found her by the old maple tree, slumped over in her specialized therapy chair. Her hands clenched tight, legs shaking uncontrollably. Her therapist, Maria, was kneeling beside her, panic in her eyes, trying to calm her. "Susie, baby, Daddy's here," I said, dropping to my knees, voice steady but heart pounding. Her brown eyes found mine, and the terror in them nearly undid me. She couldn't speak, not when the spasms hit this hard, but I knew what she was trying to say. It hurt. Bad. I reached for her arm, guiding her through the deep breathing we'd practiced, while Maria checked the emergency meds. Just then, I heard tires screech outside. Doors slammed. My head snapped up. 2 police officers had jumped from their cruiser, hands already on their holsters, one of them shouting, "Step away from her. We got a call about a violent individual." For half a second, I thought I was dreaming. Then the second officer reached for his taser. My body moved on instinct. I stepped in front of Susie, arms raised, badge nearly tearing from the chain around my neck. "Put that down!" I barked. "I'm Police Chief Marcus Rowe, and that's my disabled daughter." Time froze. Susie whimpered behind me, and that was the moment everything changed. The younger officer froze mid-motion, his hand hovering inches from his taser. His eyes widened as he processed my words, glancing at the badge I held up, then back at my face. The older one, taller, broader, stepped forward, his posture shifting from aggression to embarrassment. "Chief Rowe?" he asked, blinking. We didn't know." "No, you didn't," I said tightly, turning slightly to check on Susie. She was trembling now, her tiny fingers wrapped around the arm of her chair, trying to disappear into herself. Maria looked stunned, one hand on Susie's shoulder, the other clutching the small red bag of emergency supplies. "We got a call," the taller officer began, clearing his throat. "Report said there was a mentally unstable person screaming and threatening people in the front yard. Said they were aggressive, maybe on something." I stared at him. "She has cerebral palsy. That's her therapy chair. She was in the middle of her morning exercises. And what you heard was a pain spasm, not a threat." My voice was low, firm, and boiling with restrained rage. "You drew weapons on a 12-year-old girl who can't even walk without assistance." The younger one looked like he wanted to crawl back into the cruiser. "We're sorry, Chief. We were just doing your job. I get it. But someone lied to you," I said, turning my gaze toward the tidy beige house across the street. Curtains twitched. I didn't need confirmation. I already knew who made the call. "She called in a false report," I muttered to no one in particular, "and nearly got my daughter killed." Maria gently reached for Susie's hand. The worst of the spasm had passed, but tears still streamed down her cheeks. That call should never have happened, and someone was going to answer for it. I didn't have to wait long. The screen door across the street creaked open, and out stepped Helen Dawes, the self-appointed queen of Maple Ridge. Perfectly coiffed silver hair, a pressed blouse that screamed country club, and an expression that belonged more in a courtroom than a cul-de-sac. She walked toward us with the stiff arrogance of someone who thought authority came from paperwork and garden parties. Her arms crossed, lips tight, eyes already narrowed in disapproval, as she surveyed the scene. "Well," she said, her voice laced with smug superiority, "it seems things got a bit out of hand this morning." She glanced at the officers, then at Susie. "I had no idea it was your daughter, Marcus." "Chief Rowe," I corrected, barely able to keep my tone civil. And you made a false police report. Helen blinked, feigning surprise. False? I simply reported what I saw, a child screaming, flailing her arms, and frightening the neighbors. It's my responsibility as HOA president to maintain peace and safety. You saw a little girl with a visible disability in her own yard, doing physical therapy, I said, stepping closer. And your first instinct was to call the police and describe her as unstable and violent? Helen didn't flinch. It's a quiet neighborhood. People pay to live in peace here. Frankly, it's not appropriate to conduct medical activities on the front lawn. It unsettles people. She's 12, I snapped, and the front yard is the only flat ground where she can stretch safely. We've done it for months. You never said a word until now. Well, she said, smoothing her blouse, I was trying to be polite, but the HOA bylaws do mention public disturbances. I've read every line of those bylaws, I cut in. You've crossed one. And she was about to find out what that meant. I could feel the old instincts flaring, the part of me trained to assert control, to issue commands, to protect the innocent with force if necessary. But this wasn't a crime scene. This was my daughter's home, my home, and the threat wasn't a weapon. It was ignorance wrapped in arrogance. I looked at Helen, standing there like she had done the neighborhood a favor, and my fists clenched at my sides. Every breath I took was calculated, deliberate, an effort to keep the father in me from becoming the officer who could arrest her on the spot. I've faced armed suspects in dark alleys, I said, my voice like ice. I've talked down men with blood on their hands and murder in their eyes. But nothing makes my heart stop like seeing my daughter scared and defenseless because someone couldn't see past her wheelchair. Helen didn't move, but the smugness faltered in her eyes. You're overreacting, she muttered. I simply enforced the rules. The rules? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You called in a report that could have gotten her killed. One twitch from that rookie, one misunderstanding, and she'd be in a body bag right now. Is that in the HOA handbook too? She stiffened. I thought she was a threat. She weighs 75 pounds and can't stand on her own, I snapped. The only thing she threatened was your illusion of order. Maria shifted awkwardly beside Susie, still holding her hand. The officers were already backing toward their cruiser, unsure if they should even still be here. I turned back to Helen, and with every ounce of restraint I had, said, You want peace? You should have knocked on my door. But now, you've started something you can't control. And I meant every word. Jasmine had been recording the whole time from our porch. She didn't say a word, just held her phone steady, her eyes burning with the same fury I felt. When I stepped back to check on Susie, she handed me the phone. This is going online, she said quietly. People need to see this. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Helen needed to be seen for who she really was, not just by the people on this street, but by anyone who ever had to swallow their outrage to keep the peace. Within 20 minutes, the video was uploaded. Within an hour, it had over 10,000 views. Local news outlets started reaching out. Friends, neighbors, even strangers were messaging us, furious on Susie's behalf. But it wasn't just the online world reacting. Our real-life neighbors began to emerge too. Carlos, the lawyer from 3 doors down, marched across the street and stood right in front of Helen's house. You know the Americans with Disabilities Act overrides every single one of your precious bylaws, right? He called out. You could be looking at federal violations. Helen peeked through her blinds but didn't respond. More people trickled over. Mrs. Kim brought a thermos of tea and stood quietly beside Maria. The Peterson twins, who'd barely waved to us before, now helped me pack up Susie's therapy equipment. The silence that had ruled this neighborhood for years was breaking. And for the first time since we moved in, It felt like people were actually seeing us, not as a disruption, but as a family, as humans. Helen's precious order was crumbling, and she didn't even know yet how far the fallout would reach. But the cameras did, and so did everyone watching. By nightfall, the video had crossed 100,000 views. Local news anchors were replaying the footage with headlines like, "Police Chief's Disabled Daughter Targeted by HOA President," and "False 911 Call Sparks Outrage." The mayor called me personally. He wasn't just concerned, he was furious. "Marcus," he said, "we've had our share of HOA complaints before, but this crosses a line." I didn't disagree. The department's legal team was already reviewing the incident, and ADA compliance officers were copied on every email. I hadn't needed to lift a finger. The world was doing the heavy lifting for me, fueled by something deeper than outrage: justice. Helen tried to stay quiet at first, but when the press showed up at her door, she cracked. "It was a misunderstanding," she said on camera, standing on her porch with that same brittle poise. "I didn't know the child was disabled." That only made it worse. The footage of Susie in her wheelchair, visible, trembling, helpless, made Helen look less like a rule follower and more like a monster in pearls. And the internet doesn't forgive monsters, especially ones who call the cops on disabled kids for existing in daylight. At home, Susie was recovering. She still flinched when she heard sirens, and her sessions had to be moved indoors for the time being. But her spirit? Unbroken. She asked me once why people hated the way she looked. I didn't know how to answer, but I promised her that what happened wouldn't go unanswered. The next day, I filed a formal civil rights complaint against Helen Dawes and the Maple Ridge HOA. I wasn't just her neighbor now. I was the wrong cop to target, and she was about to learn what that meant in full. 2 days later, Helen showed up on my doorstep. Gone was the smug composure. She wore a tailored suit now, but the tightness in her smile and the nervous twitch in her eye gave her away. "Chief Rowe," she began, voice unusually soft. "I wanted to personally apologize for the misunderstanding." I didn't invite her in. I just crossed my arms and waited. "I never meant any harm to your daughter," she continued, glancing over my shoulder toward the living room, where Susie was quietly coloring with Jasmine. "I think things have been blown out of proportion." I let the silence hang. She shifted uncomfortably. "Look, the HOA board is very concerned about the attention this is bringing. The property values." "That's what you're worried about? Property values?" My voice was quiet but sharp. "You called the police on a child. You endangered her life, humiliated my family, and broke the law." Her lips thinned. "It wasn't my intent." "But it was your action. Intent doesn't matter when you falsify an emergency call," I said. "You filed a false report, violated federal disability law, and trespassed HOA authority. And I've already handed the entire case over to the DA's office." She paled. "The district attorney?" "I also reported you to the ADA Civil Enforcement Unit. And just so you know, Carlos down the street, he's helping several neighbors file their own claims." Helen blinked, backing up a step. "I just thought, maybe we could resolve this without getting lawyers involved." I took a slow step forward. "Then maybe you should have knocked on my door like a decent human being. But now, you'd better knock on your lawyers." For the first time, real panic flickered in her eyes, and it looked a lot like justice. By the end of the week, Helen Dawes was no longer president of the Maple Ridge HOA. An emergency vote had been called, and the results were unanimous. Every neighbor who had quietly endured her tyranny came forward, their stories stacking like bricks in a wall she could no longer climb. Trespassing, harassment, selective enforcement of rules. And now, a federal investigation. She packed her things within days, and vanished from the neighborhood like a bad dream finally over. Susie's recovery was slow, but steady. We resumed therapy in the backyard, where the sun still warmed her cheeks, and the neighbors now waved and smiled as they passed. Mrs. Kim dropped off handmade cookies every Thursday. Carlos offered pro bono legal help to others affected. The Peterson twins even built a birdhouse just for Susie. The HOA's new leadership, a group of level-headed, compassionate residents, voted unanimously to revise the bylaws, removing outdated, discriminatory language and adding protections for residents with medical needs. Peace returned, not the brittle kind Helen had clung to, but a genuine one, rooted in understanding. I tucked Susie in one night and kissed her forehead. "You're safe," I whispered. "Not just from illness, but from people like her." 3 months later, Susie and I sat beneath the elm tree in our backyard, her therapy chair nestled in the shade. She watched the birds flutter around the feeder, her laughter light and unburdened. Across the street, a new family moved into Helen's old house, welcomed with smiles, not rules. I looked around and saw a neighborhood transformed, not by punishment, but by truth. "You know," Susie said, leaning against me, "maybe the world's not so bad." I wrapped an arm around her shoulders and smiled. Not when people finally see what really matters. Sometimes justice doesn't knock. It roots itself and blooms.